All right, first video back after a long hiatus. I'm going to go scriptless and talk about a video that I've never seen before as sort of a response and then make an actual script and respond to it properly later. And I'm going to be talking about and disagreeing with one of the people that inspired me to make this channel, Brandon F. Today, I'm going to be talking about how World War I was completely in vain and should not have happened. Brandon F. released a video not too long ago detailing how World War I was not in vain, how there was purpose behind it. But I have not watched it. I did talk to some people who have to get their opinions on it because it's kind of a long video and I haven't had time to really sit down, watch it, and listen. But from what I've gathered, the title isn't clickbait. He's making the argument that Britain had a purpose fighting in that war and that it was not a vain fight, that there was some glorious reason behind it. And I have to disagree. World War I was 100% a vain fight. The British soldiers did die in vain. There was no point to the fighting. And saying otherwise takes away from the tragedy that is World War I. It takes away from the impact it had and what the soldiers felt when they got back home. It's a disservice to the men who fought to say that. I'm going to save a lot of what I have to say for after I watch the video and make a proper video about this. I'm not necessarily responding to the video because I haven't watched it. There's nothing to respond to. I'm merely making a video talking about how it was in vain because it was a vain fight. I'll make another video dissecting his when I have time to sit down and write that out. And it will be scripted, unlike this one, which is completely offhand and I have no idea where I'm going with this until I start talking. But let's get into it. Let's talk about how World War I was a vain fight and why we need to look at it from that perspective. Otherwise, it loses its historical impact and weight. What were the purposes behind fighting this war? A lot of people talk about it as sort of this national identity and fighting for one's country and dying for a country in combat being one of the greatest things you as a young man could possibly do. This idea, this propaganda that had lasted as sort of the staple for getting men to join the military was shattered after World War I. That propaganda stopped working everywhere except for the United States, where we still worship the military as the institution of killing and death. But I digress. World War I shattered the European perception of military being this be-all, end-all institution for national security and national growth. Because World War I showed that war is meaningless. And if war is meaningless, how can you not die in vain? People were watching their sons die, getting letters home talking about how, oh, we're so sorry your son was killed in combat fighting for king and country. And when the war ended, Britain was in no better position than they were when the war started. Britain was technically in a worse position. All of the world's economy went from London to Wall Street. The world was now looking to America, not Britain. France lost a good portion of their young generation, the men who would make up the next generation of France. The best died. The German Empire was broken up. They lost so many men for what? To lose? Italy instantly went into revolution. They got nothing. Austria, gone. There is no Habsburg monarchy anymore. Russia, gone. They were in the middle of a civil war. Serbia lost, I think, a third of their population total in one war. Montenegro suffered. The Ottoman Empire was gone, and Turkey was in the midst of a revolution and getting attacked by Greece. The world was on fire. And 10 years later, the economic policies set forward during World War I and the movement of the economic capital of the world from London to New York would eventually cascade into the Great Depression in 1929. World War I was pointless, and the only nation that truly came out on top was the United States, which probably explains why the United States has never had an extreme anti-military stance publicly within our culture, except for during the Vietnam War. The idea that there was purpose behind the First World War, that somehow those people did not die in vain, is such an intense coping mechanism for something that happened 100 years ago. It surprises me anyone is trying to make that argument. There was no point to the First World War. There was no point to why those men died. If you try to claim that someone died in a war that was specifically set forward because the home country wanted to conquer more land, that is a death that was in vain. Because many of these people were sold that they were fighting a just cause to protect Belgium, to protect the free world. Meanwhile, they're fighting with their ally being Russia. They weren't fighting to protect the free world. The men of Britain who fought and died in the trenches thinking that they were protecting democracy were fighting for a country that signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I'm probably mispronouncing that, so please feel free to make fun of me in the comments. They were fighting for a country that was actively kicking their allies out, that was actively trying to hurt the people groups that were helping them win the war. They were fighting for groups that were holding onto their colonies with an iron fist. But they were sold the idea of democracy, that was the reason they were fighting. If you go to war to fight for democracy, but you end up fighting for the nation that is strongly opposing it within its own empire, you are fighting and dying in vain. But what about Belgium? This seems to be a very common argument for people saying that there was some purpose to the British involvement. This seems to be some point for the war itself, fighting for Belgium. Belgium had a peaceful out. They could have let Germany walk through their land. This isn't to put the blame on them. This is to simply say that Belgium made that decision to fight Germany, to protect their own national sovereignty, to say that, no, we're our own nation, you can't violate our neutrality. And Britain could have stepped up to help them and say, no, if you do this, Germany, we will support Belgium. We will get into this war. And Germany would not have invaded. They would have simply put up defensive positions along the French-German border and stuffed everyone in Russia. The true reason why Britain got involved was because of their empire and the threat Germany posed economically and internationally. That was why Britain was finding an excuse to get involved and try to make it so that that excuse would come to fruition without necessarily saying or without necessarily lying to Germany. So instantly, Britain has no foot to stand on for their justification. So then let's look at France. They were supporting an ally, right? But they wanted that revenge against Germany. They wanted to take back Alsace-Lorraine. They wanted to take that back and to shore up the government shortcomings. They wanted to take advantage of a Germany that was hemmed in on two sides by two very large enemies. On paper, it would seem like France could handle Germany just by themselves, let alone with Russia. And Britain, well, they could probably come and get involved too. And now Germany's gone. France's biggest rival removed. They'll have so much more land in Africa. They'll have their home regions back. They'll have no more real political enemies on continental Europe. Okay, well, how about Russia? They wanted to shore up their own side. They wanted to make sure that their enemies of Germany and Austria were taken out. They wanted to take the Carpathians from Austria. They wanted to take the Eastern Habsburg Empire away from the Habsburgs. They wanted to take that land for themselves. They were out there for expansion, and they fanned the flames of war specifically just for that purpose. Okay, so Russia's was in vain. They weren't protecting anybody. They were protecting their own national interests. That's a vain fight if there ever was one. They weren't fighting some defensive war. They provoked it. So did France. You can't not die in vain for a war your own nation provoked simply to have because of their own national interests. All right, well, Germany then. Well, they wanted a preemptive war against Russia, and they knew that they'd have to fight against France, and they figured it's a win-win. We'll take out both of them. We'll make sure that France gets knocked down a peg, and Russia will just send into oblivion to keep them down so that we stay as the top dog. Okay, so they weren't fighting a defensive war. They were also trying to provoke stuff. You can't have you're not dying for any just cause at that point. Okay, Austria-Hungary. They provoked the war with Serbia. They specifically wanted to knock out Serbia and take that influence away from Russia and secure the Balkans and try to put down the flames that were rising out of that area. All right, well, what about Serbia? They were just blatantly attacked. Well, half of their government supported the assassination. And with recent documents coming to light, There were several individuals within Serbia that funded the assassination, that helped plan it, that helped train the assassins, that specifically spoke to people like Gavrilo Princip. Okay, so Serbia provoked it. They knew what they were doing. They wanted a war. There was no one that fought for anything other than their own self-interest and gains. And the people were sold the lies of defensive war because that was the only reason they could get past the Workers' International, the agreement that no one would fight the war and that there would be a general strike if war broke out. And they were sold the lies of a defensive conflict to go off and fight in terrible conditions and die for what they thought was a just war, something that they were told would protect their country, when in reality, their country was merely out for their own interests. They weren't out to fight some defensive conflict. They weren't out to try to just protect themselves and stay alive. They weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting for domination, telling the people that they were fighting for survival. The only people fighting for survival were the people trying to stay alive in the trenches every single day. If you actually look at it, if the war for the Entente was about democracy, why was Italy brought in on their side? Why was Russia on their side? Both of those nations blatantly fighting for their own self-interests, with kings, with czars, this anti-democracy stance that ended up having in Italy got kicked out and in Russia got kicked out through revolution. Both specifically joining the war with promises of land. In World War II, nations joined the Allies because it was the fight against the expansive Nazis. They didn't join because they wanted land out of it. They joined out of their own self-preservation. In World War I, every nation who joined a side did not do it by some moral obligation. They did it because they wanted their own self-interests fulfilled in terms of gaining land, gaining influence, or gaining some sort of economic power. There was no moral nation joining the war. And anyone who fought for one of those nations under the pretense of you're fighting for democracy, you're fighting for your nation's survival, you're fighting to preserve your country, you're fighting a defensive war, they died in vain. World War I was a fight of vanity between nations who wanted to go off and conquer, who wanted to expand. There was no just fight. There was nothing there justifiable about anyone's involvement in that war. The blame for it can still be discussed. I have my own video talking about who's to blame for the First World War, but the reasons why they chose the things they did that led to war was solely because of the self-interest of protecting the nation's expansionism, of throwing the nation's influence further across the globe in these grand plans to have more dominance over continental Europe and the colonial world that existed at the time. America didn't join because of some justice, freedom-loving, democracy-loving indignation of trying to support the nations that spread freedom, democracy, and the right for people to choose what their own nations wanted. No, they joined because the industries in America were tied up in the Entente. All the industries were supporting Britain and France. They put their bets on them. The entire American economy, the American government put their bets on Britain and France winning, and America could not let them lose. So, of course, shortly after Russia gets kicked out and it's shown that, yes, things are going to go south for the Entente, America uses unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman Telegraph, which neither of those should be pretenses for war, as pretenses for war. Selling the lie of democracy and freedom to the people so that they would think they were fighting a just fight. Every person who died in the war died in vain. There was no just fight. There was no justifiable reason for those nations to be involved. Every country fought for their own self-interests, for their own expansionism, to spread their influence at the expense of others. The few people who didn't die in vain were those fighting for their own sovereign nation, The Poles. The Polish didn't die in vain. They died fighting for their own country, to have their own nation, their own self-determination. The Ukrainians didn't die in vain. They fought for their own country, their own self-determination. The Finns revolted. They didn't die in vain. They fought for their own country. They wanted their own independence, and they got it. The Czechs didn't die in vain. They fought for their own country. They wanted their own independence, and they got that. But the individuals fighting for the big empires and the nations getting involved simply for expansion, they died in vain. World War I was a war that should not have happened. The Powder Keg of Europe, the series that I'm still going to work on, discusses this, and we'll discuss this in great detail. But the Concert of Europe ended in the crescendo, in the climax that was the First World War. And it killed off everybody. It destroyed the continent of Europe. Europe's absolute power over the world, their heyday, their iron grip on the world economy, on world politics, on the world's militaries, vanished after that war. It destroyed European dominance. It was not some great success, some heroic story. It was a tragedy of self-destruction. And trying to make the claim that people didn't die in vain, that it wasn't a vain fight, is such a large coping mechanism, I'm surprised anyone has tried to make that argument. It's falling for the most basic of propaganda and is defeating and ruining the message that so many veterans after the war tried to show, this anti-war message. The point that war is hell and that we should never willingly walk into it, no matter how justified we may think we are in the moment of going into the conflict. Because don't think for a second that the individuals of Germany, of Britain, of France, of Austria, of Russia didn't think they were going into that war for justifiable reasons. Everyone thought they were, otherwise no one would have fought. That's the lesson from the First World War. And trying to say that there was a justified side when there wasn't takes away from the actual lessons we can learn from history, that we can learn from this conflict. That's why World War I is so important. Because no one was right and people willingly fought for that. It is a warning not to fall for the propaganda of the modern era. It is a warning not to easily let yourself slip into this propaganda of, oh, I'm going to choose a side because that side's justifiable and we're going to willingly fight for them. Because in World War I, people did that and they died and they fought for nothing. Their nations gained nothing. There was no justification. They fought and died for a lie. Fathers sent their sons to fight and die for something they thought was real, and it turned out to be a lie. That's why most nations after the war fell into revolution, because people tasted what they thought was going to be sugar water, and they spit it out when they realized that it was nothing but a bitter poison, and they attacked the person who fed it to them. We cannot allow ourselves to become detached from these lessons. Otherwise, and I hate to say it because it's said so often when people are talking about shallow subjects, but this is not a shallow subject. We are doomed to repeat the mistakes that were made in July of 1914. And we cannot let that happen. World War I was meaningless. There was no reason for that fight, but it had to happen. We can't let ourselves become complacent in thinking that every conflict is justified, that there is a correct side. We can't become so hyped up on these superhero movies of good versus bad to ignore the fact that most things are gray. Otherwise, we will continue to run in circles until we dig ourselves a pit we can't climb out of. And there'll be no one to save us when it starts to flood. I'm the Wolf of 1918. Thank you guys for watching and supporting my channel. It recently got monetized by YouTube, which is a huge milestone, so I'm actually making money from people watching my videos and ad revenue and stuff. It's pretty cool to hit that milestone, which is sort of like the last like YouTube milestone when it comes to that whole thing versus, you know, getting, you know, subscriber milestones and everything. So if you guys like the video, you can go ahead and like and subscribe. It was pretty unscripted. I still don't know how I'm going to end this. Comment me your guys' feedback. I will actually watch his video and write a script based off of that. I'm being very open that I haven't seen it. So if I, you know, come across like I haven't seen it, it's because I haven't. I saw the video. I saw the video was posted. I talked to some people who had seen it, and I was just like, well, I'm going to make a video specifically about how it wasn't in vain, and then I will respond to his video and make a proper script. So that video will come out at some point. I apologize for the hiatus. Things have been really crazy the past freaking few months. But I promise to be getting back into videos soon. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Juice.